Before we begin, I need to make a quick nod to the fact that the Precinct Omega Kickstarter is now live. We've met our minimum funding target and are now driving towards some stretch goals. So, if you'd like to see some quality, hard-ish sci-fi minis in a market dominated by grimdark, gothic and raypunk, please check it out and pledge your support. Now, I had intended to talk more about the pre-launch process in the show, but time was against me for all kinds of reasons. Rest assured there'll be post-completion analysis of the Kickstarter experience once we're done. But now, on to the meat of this week's news, which is the announcement of Warmachine Mk IV, and to begin with I want to encourage you to go and read the announcement from Privateer Press. It is one of the most, if not the most, coherent articulations of the experience of producing, marketing and developing a miniatures wargame that I've ever read, and it's only made more poignant by the company's decline from being a major market challenger to Games Workshop to being barely counted in the top 6 today. Now, although I suspect most of my audience has already heard of Privateer Press and Warmachine, I think it is worth taking a trip through the company's history to understand how it ended up where it is today. Privateer Press was officially founded in 2000 by Matt Wilson and Brian Snoddy. The Warmachine miniatures game, for which they're best known, was published in 2003, but Privateer was originally established to publish D&D 3rd edition supplements under the Open Gaming license. Matt and Brian are both artists with some serious credibility in the gaming market as illustrators for Wizards of the Coast, among others, but Privateer Press was a chance to flex their creative muscles in other directions, specifically into the setting they invented together called the Iron Kingdoms. The Iron Kingdoms are a steampunk fantasy setting in which the major influences are a kind of mage called Warcasters, who can draw upon mystical powers not simply to cast spells but to energise the minds of giant steam-powered war robots. And these robots, called warjacks, are the principal means by which the competing powers of the Iron Kingdoms do battle. Between them, Brian and Matt developed not only the fictional background but also the aesthetic of the setting, with hundreds of detailed drawings, paintings and even blueprints depicting the denizens of their imaginary world. Now, I don't know for sure, but I think it's a good bet that Matt and Brian worked on the Iron Kingdom setting a good deal before founding Privateer Press, because it wasn't long after the company was formed that they were joined by Mk MkIV. Sources differ as to whether Mike was poached from Games Workshop or left independently and then joined Privateer Press, but I have it on good authority that Mike, who was then the lead in-house painter at GW in the early 2000s and a formative figure in the lives of every young Warhammer geek at the time, was straining for more influence over the development of miniatures at GW. And that was influence that the newly minted Privateer Press was happy to give him. Matt and Brian, after all, had all the concept sketches and designs they could possibly need, but they had little knowledge of the process of commissioning sculpts and casts and of putting manufacturing into play, and that was knowledge Mike could bring to the table. The speed with which Privateer Press went from formation to releasing Warmachine Prime, with an extensive range of miniatures and a beautifully presented rulebook full of art and painted models, is an indicator of the company's intent. I'm not sure where the money came from to bootstrap the initial launch. At one point I thought there were some angel investors behind the enterprise, but I've since been told that Matt bankrolled the whole thing himself. If that's true, then damn, I've got a bit of insight into how hard and expensive it is to publish a miniatures game, and yeah. Still, however it came about, Games Workshop was declining under an outdated business model and unresponsive leadership, and Warmachine was there to offer something new, but not too new. The game itself was similar to GW's main property of Warhammer 40,000 in that it was an I-Go-You-Go system with a mixture of free-form squads and individual heroes. This format meant that you could play with comparatively few minis but scale up easily. It also had a couple of interesting mechanics that made it stand out. First was the player's generals, the Warcasters, who built up their magical resources or focus each turn and who could parcel these out to their warjacks. The Jacks didn't need the magic to act, but they did need it to do their most interesting moves and tricks, and this created a compelling game within a game in which players allocated their focus and their opponents tried to anticipate what they were going to do with it. The other distinctive feature was what came to be called caster kill. Whilst in Warhammer games it had always been implied that the general of an army represented the player, that idea had always been treated as an abstraction. But in Warmachine it was made more literal, because if a player's warcaster was killed, That was it, game over. All other objectives were there only to decide who had won if both casters were still vertical at the end of the game. Other than attracting players with the original aesthetic and compelling rules, Warmachine also took a big step ahead of Games Workshop in two other major ways that, in my opinion, were closely related. Privateer Press was a US company, and Warmachine was explicitly geared towards tournament-style competitions. The US wargames community has always been slightly different to the UK one by dint of population distribution. The compressed population in the UK means that you're basically always within at least an hour of a community of like-minded hobbyists with whom you can meet up and play games on a regular basis. But in the US this just isn't the case for many people, so travelling to play might mean a journey hours long, overnight stays or even an interior flight. Naturally, therefore, if you're travelling to play, US hobbyists want to get as much dice rolling in as humanly possible, which leads to them wanting to play game after game after game across 2 or more days. A scenario that naturally suits itself better to tournament play. Games Workshop had for years resisted being a tournament game. In the US, 40k was openly described as a beer and pretzels game, meaning one not to be taken too seriously. And internationally, GW actively refused to get involved with sponsoring or endorsing tournaments. We could do a deep dive into why this was the case and why, whilst it was bad for GW at the time, it was probably a good decision in the long run, but this isn't the time or the place for that discussion. What's important is that PP was offering players in the US a homegrown alternative to the Limeys that was better adapted for their hobby community. The other thing that Privateer Press did that was, by the standards of the miniatures wargaming market, revolutionary, was to create a living setting for their game. Now, this probably isn't that surprising in retrospect because Brian and Matt came out of Wizards of the Coast, who'd already embraced the evolving narrative for Magic the Gathering as a way to keep the game fresh and justify shifts in rules and the release of new products that sustained the conversation. But in the tabletop wargaming world, this was practically heresy. But Privateer Press's willingness to kill off characters, shift political boundaries and introduce whole new factions was a revolution that I believe directly led to GW's willingness to allow their own setting to evolve and to the same idea being adopted in games like Infinity, Malifaux, Wild West Exodus and even my own Horizon Wars. All of this, combined with GW's decline and contraction in the early 2000s, led to Privateer Press going from strength to strength, and they quickly followed up Warmachine with another radical concept, Hordes. Hordes was a second game in the same setting, but unlike games like Necromunda or Moortime from GW, Hordes was 100% cross-compatible with Warmachine. 2 players could have a game in which one was playing Warmachine and the other was playing Hordes. To this day, I don't know of any major release in miniatures wargaming to have done anything like it. But other decisions came straight from the GW playbook. PP released their own paint range. They began a monthly magazine. They licensed their property to become a digital game. They released smaller games in the same Iron Kingdom setting. A lot of people were predicting that GW's days were done and PP was going to be the new colossus of miniatures wargames, and no one was that sad about the idea. But 2 things happened that reversed the rise of Privateer Press. The first halted PP's growth and was their own stupid fault. The second was out of their control, but they should have seen it coming. So the first of those was that they decided to diversify their intellectual property with 2 new releases, Level 7 Escape and Monsterpocalypse. And don't get me wrong, these are both pretty decent games. Level 7 and its sequels in particular is a pretty cool miniatures board game, and I recommend it to anyone who loves sci-fi horror and alien conspiracy theories. And Monsterpocalypse is a love poem to over-the-top Japanese cartoons from the 80s and 90s. But they both require a huge investment of capital from Privateer Press, whilst being significant departures from the features of Warmachine and Hordes that allowed them, still a comparative mouse to GW's elephant, to establish dominance. Now, it could be argued that it was an attempt to diversify to avoid having all their eggs in one IP basket, and it might be that it was because it was around this time that both Brian and Mike left Privateer Press, and Matt wanted to make sure that he had IP in hand that Brian in particular couldn't lay legal claim to in any future dispute. I genuinely don't know, and I have no reason to believe that Brian and Mike's departures were anything but amicable. In any case, it was a huge miscalculation. Privateer Press was on the rise, but it just didn't have the kind of capital flexibility to be taking a risk on new intellectual properties, and it wasn't their only mistake along the way. One of PP's earliest mistakes was to tie itself heavily to an early branding slogan, "Play like you've got a pair." And whilst they could eventually distance themselves from that branding, they were forever tarred with a misogynistic brush, despite a cast of excellent female characters in their setting. A later move that presaged their decline was a shift from white metal to plastic, largely in response to the cost pressures on the price of white metal. PP Minis were in many cases substantial lumps of metal, comparable to the second edition Space Marine Dreadnought from Games Workshop. They were heavy, and they also tied themselves to that as a branding feature, calling Warmachine the game of heavy metal combat, which is also a sly dig at GW, from whom they'd poached Mike MkIV, former head of the heavy metal in-house painting studio at that company. They may have been forgiven a shift to plastic, much as GW was, if they'd gone for high-impact polystyrene, but instead they went to a formulation of lower-cost poured mould plastic. For board game miniatures, this standard of plastic is absolutely fine, but for miniatures wargaming, where players expect a certain level of crisp precision, it was a disaster. It also sent the market a strong message that PP couldn't afford to switch to HIPS, which requires a massive capital injection and huge volume sales to compensate. It was a sign to everyone that Privateer Press was already in decline. They would eventually abandon plastic and return to white metal, but by then it was too late, because the other factor in play was, of course, that big companies don't go down without a fight. It's my considered opinion that Privateer Press fundamentally never had a chance. GW's resources of talent, cultural capital, and most of all, money, far outstripped PP's even at its absolute height. But the decision at GW to blow up the Warhammer Old World and release Age of Sigmar was a body blow to Warmachine and Hordes. It was a stripped-back skirmish-like game with a low entry point and a seriously eye-catching range of miniatures. And although its early release was mechanically underwhelming, it was quickly optimised for the kind of tabletop experience people enjoyed. Although GW continues to this day to be reluctant to be drawn into tournament-style competition, Age of Sigmar and arguably newer editions of Warhammer 40,000 are better geared towards tournaments than past editions. To me, the final sign that PP's status as a challenger had been put firmly to bed was in 2017, when they went to Kickstarter with Widower's Wood, a new board game release. I've spoken about established companies using a platform like Kickstarter as what amounts to a pre-order tool before. I understand why they do it. I appreciate the value it has to increase visibility and grab publicity, but all of that just says that they lack the capital to achieve those outcomes any other way. Since then, they've returned to Kickstarter 11 more times, most notably to launch a whole new miniatures game, Warcaster Neo Mechanica. And I think what disappoints me the most is that if PP had released this game instead of Level 7 and Monster Apocalypse, they may never have fallen so far. It is everything a new release should have been. It riffs on the features of Warmachine that people loved when it came out, but it does it in a new and interesting way. It has a great aesthetic that puts a sci-fi spin on their existing miniatures range. It is thematically tied to their original IP, but it's clearly its own thing with its own unique features. But now Mark IV has been released, and Matt, well, I can't believe it was anyone but Matt writing this, has explicitly called out GW. He says in the press statement, "We knew we couldn't blow up the world and start over, no matter how easy it would make things for us. We all know how that plays out in the short term, because we all watched it happen with another game." In case you missed it, he's referring to Warhammer Age of Sigmar there. This is unprecedented. I don't think I've ever seen a miniatures gaming company explicitly refer to another company's product in the press release for their new product. This speaks both to the massive industry presence GW exercises and Matt's deep personal frustration at feeling so close to dominance and yet having fallen so far. And he doesn't stop there, because in the same paragraph he goes on. "We don't have the kind of resources the publisher of the other game has to contract marketing firms and PR managers. We're not a publicly traded company with hundreds of stores with a reliable stream of foot traffic bringing curious new customers to their games every day." Well, no, they aren't. I can't deny that, but they so nearly were. I don't think PP ever planned to open their own stores. The fact that GW did is partly because they started out as a retail store, so it wasn't that big a leap to be more than one retail store. But also because they were growing at the time when business rates and the commercial rental market in the UK were at an all-time low. Plus, also, the UK is a much easier place to do this because it's geographically smaller than most US states. A key feature in GW's decline in the 90s and early 2000s was that it overreached itself by expanding internationally without appreciating the scale up in costs and effort that would entail. But in every other respect, such as being a publicly traded company with the wherewithal to hire marketing firms and PR managers, Privateer Press was absolutely on the cusp of reaching the point where people might have been photoshopping Donald Trump's face onto Kharchev the Terrible instead of the Emperor of Mankind. And they fluffed it. But despite that, PP isn't dead. It may not enjoy GW's cultural capital, but it's still a going concern that pays people salaries and creates new content. As Matt quite rightly points out, they've been releasing new minis every month without fail for years, and that's no small achievement in itself. The whole statement, which I absolutely recommend you read if you are even slightly interested in how the business of miniatures wargaming works, is an honest and logical explanation for why a new edition was necessary and how they've gone about composing it. Given their history, I have every reason to think that Mark IV is going to be a fine rule set, but that's not the most interesting bit. No. The most interesting bit is that Mark IV is moving to being a purely 3D printed miniatures range, which is either the stupidest or the smartest move that PP has ever made, and I genuinely don't know which it is. I mean, I suspect they're making that move because they literally have no alternative. White metal manufacturing is increasingly expensive right now. HIPS injection moulding requires a kind of upfront investment that PP just can't command. And there's no question that 3D printers are up and coming as a hobby tool. GW can probably swallow the hit of people printing pirated designs of Counts-As minis for their games right now, but smaller businesses like Corvus Belli and Privateer Press just can't. Every printed warjack is a quantifiable loss, so it makes sense to jump on board, embrace the inevitable, and try to get ahead of the technology curve. The question that's yet to be answered is whether 3D printers are really sufficiently common among tabletop wargamers that this move isn't going to just kill Warmachine on the spot. I don't know. On the one hand, you can look at the number of successful Kickstarters for 3D minis and the rise of people selling some exquisite pieces as printable miniatures and apparently making a good living out of it, and conclude that yes, the time is right. I'm also aware of people offering freelance printing services who are winding up business because so many of their customers are now buying their own printers. But despite that, I talked to my own hobby circle, and although almost all of them would like to own a printer, only about 20 to 30% of them actually do. Although, weirdly, on Twitter it managed to be over 50%, so maybe my immediate circle isn't representative. However, even if it turns out that Privateer Press has made a genius move by going all digital for their miniatures, it's unlikely to save them in the long run, because the move is driven not by innovation, but by desperation. Digital miniatures and 3D printing are almost certainly the future of the hobby, but I don't believe that future is here yet. And that saddens me, because as I hope you've gathered, I have a lot of time for Privateer Press, for Warmachine, and for what they so nearly achieved. I'm not sure what the future holds for them. Judging by recent Kickstarters, it may be that eventually Privateer Press reverts to where it began, Matt Wilson writing supplements for D&D while the miniatures game is increasingly sidelined. But I'm usually wrong about these things, as the YouTube comment section never fails to remind me. The time has come, however, to talk again about my favourite topic, myself, or at least what lessons I think there are to learn from Privateer Press, its rise, its fall, and its latest release. The first thing is that our market still has room for genius. Not in the sense of brilliant intelligence, but in the sense of a perfect breakout success. These things, of course, don't happen on their own. What Matt and Brian first brought to the table was a brilliantly and intricately realised aesthetic concept, which they then matched with an innovative and timely game concept. But both of these things needed a significant financial underpinning to make them happen. How they and or Mike MkIV managed to achieve the level of market penetration they did and where the money came from, I don't know. But that threefold combination can lead to extraordinary success. Corvus Belli did it before with Infinity the Game, Weird Games did it with Malifaux, and even as we speak, Parabellum Wargames is attempting to do it with Conquest Last Argument of Kings. But Genius will only carry a product so far. We've seen Privateer Press, Weird Games and other early breakouts stall and falter, not because there was a flaw in the original concept, but because they allowed success to persuade them that their upwards trajectory was unstoppable, when in fact it was incredibly fragile. The other thing to learn are that first, Games Workshop pays attention to its competition, learns from them and will push back if they get too close to cutting into GW's market share. But we also learned that GW plays fair. They didn't try to buy out PP or raise spurious lawsuits to tie up their time and money, although heaven knows GW hasn't shied away from spurious lawsuits in the past. No, GW raised their game. I may be no great fan of GW's game design, but I can't deny that they're doing a lot better now than they have in the past. And at least part of this can be ascribed to the fact that PP gave them a real scare. If you or I then wanted to recreate PP success today, then what would we need? Well, as mentioned, you'd need to start with a powerful aesthetic vision. This means that any successful project needs at least one high-quality concept artist on board. In this business, aesthetics alone can drive initial success. Next, you need a game design vision that meshes with and matches the aesthetic. I've talked before at length about trying to achieve this synthesis, and Warmachine is a marvellous example of doing it right. Finally, you need a shed load of hard cash. Sculpting, casting, packaging and distributing miniatures is a marketing task of epic proportions, and it's the area where most attempts fail. If we look at other examples of success, however fleeting, we can see that they invariably manage to marry these three factors to some extent. But where they failed, it was nearly always in this final capacity. Eventually, the cash ran out and the income wasn't enough to sustain continuous development. This is fundamentally a very hard industry in which to make money from selling miniatures. But that just doesn't stop people trying. I mean, just this week I popped into my local gaming store, Incom Gaming in Cheltenham, to find a whole display of a new fantasy skirmish game called Moonstone, which seems to be trying to do the same thing all over again. Now, Moonstone's aesthetic is, to me, a huge turn-off. I really don't like their minis. But I know some people are raving about them, and that's great for them. They've got the first two pillars down tight, and they launched off a successful Kickstarter, so presumably the money's okay for now, but can it be sustained? So, sure, Precinct Omega is running a Kickstarter to sell some minis, but do I see myself going hard into the miniatures manufacturing world? Almost certainly not. All the same, if you'd like to back the Kickstarter, please do, and meanwhile, I'll speak to you again next time. Precinct Omega is supported through sales of miniatures and games you can find at precinctomega.co.uk, such as our bestseller Horizon Wars Zero Dark, sci-fi skirmish wargaming you can play solo, co-op or against an opponent with whatever miniatures you love best. But I also rely on the feedback, suggestions and generosity of the patrons you can see scrolling here. If you'd like to join their ranks, get access to behind-the-scenes content and previews of new releases, and be invited to the Precinct Omega Discord, then please follow the link to support the Patreon campaign.